All these things happened within a period of no more than a few months. One day during September 1965, Helen told Bill she felt she was about to do something very unusual. She was concerned about the feeling because she had no idea what the something was going to be. All she knew was that it was going to happen soon. Since Helen had started keeping a diary immediately after her visit to Virginia Beach, Bill suggested that if she wrote down whatever occurred to her in connection with the unusual something, she might get a clue as to what it was to be. Nothing came of her attempts at first, and she was on the verge of giving up the idea, when one evening in October, while sitting in her bedroom, the now familiar inner voice began to give her definite instructions. She panicked and immediately telephoned Bill. "You know that inner voice? It won't leave me alone." "What is it saying?" Bill asked. "It keeps saying, 'This is a Course in Miracles, please take notes.'" "What am I going to do?" she pleaded. Calmly and supportively, Bill said, "Why don't you take the notes? Take them down in that shorthand you use." "But Bill," Helen persisted, "what if it's gibberish? Then I'll know I'm crazy." "Helen, let me tell you something," he said, ignoring her remark. "Since our Rochester trip, I've been doing some reading, which I haven't shared with you, because you're so antagonistic to the whole subject. But there have been numbers of people, some of them very well-known people, who have had creative inspiration come through them in a mystical way. Einstein claimed to get information this way. And certainly the great playwrights, and what about all the mystical poets?" "I'm not a mystical poet," she protested. "I'm a psychologist, and I don't know that I believe in this." "Well, since you can't make it go away, why don't you take it down and bring it into the office early, before the staff arrives, and we'll go over it together. And if it's gibberish, we'll tear it up, and no one will ever know. Promise, Bill?" "Promise." Helen hung up, went into the living room, and told Louise she was going to do some work in the bedroom, and would be out shortly. She closed the bedroom door, turned off the overhead light, and sat in a chair by a lamp, where she allowed herself to listen. This is what she heard the first night. "This is a Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take it is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It means only that you can elect what you want to take at a given time. The course does not aim at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. This course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God." Although the voice wanted to continue, Helen was in a panic and she refused to listen further. She quickly closed her shorthand book and put it into the briefcase she carried back and forth to work each day. Then she went into the living room and told Louise she was going to bed. The next morning, Bill got to the hospital at 7:30, a half hour earlier than usual. He found Helen already there, in a state of great agitation. "I don't know what to do, Bill. I just don't know what to do about it." Bill suggested she read him what she had taken down and offered to type what she read since. "I'm a better typist than you." This she managed to do, despite some uncharacteristic stuttering. "Sounds rather interesting to me, Helen," he said. "Is that all there was?" "No," Helen answered. "It seemed to want to go on, but I got afraid." "How do the words come?" Bill asked. "It's hard to describe," she answered. "It can't be an hallucination, really, because the voice does not come from outside. It's all internal. There's no actual sound and the words come mentally, but very clearly. It's a kind of inner dictation, you might say. Do you know what you're writing? Bill asked. Or would you describe it as an automatic process? Oh no, it's not automatic at all. I'm perfectly aware of what I'm doing. Why don't you try and write some more tonight? Bill suggested. See what happens. I don't think I can, she answered. I really find it too upsetting. Despite her reluctance to continue writing, she did not have the ability to eliminate the voice. This became obvious that very afternoon when she was on the telephone. As soon as she hung up the receiver, the inner voice began. She jumped up and hurtled into Bill's office to tell him what was happening. After reassuring her again that there was nothing to be frightened about, he suggested that the best thing for her to do was simply to take the words down whenever they came, and see if that were less disturbing to her than continuing to fight it. She argued with him for almost half an hour, pointing out that this was not what she wanted to do. But even while she was telling Bill this, during his responses, the inner voice would gently reappear. In desperation, Helen finally agreed to try to take the words down. But just until I see what it is, she added. It took less than 15 minutes for her to get an idea of what it is. For shortly after she returned to her desk, the voice began to dictate the first words of the text of A Course in Miracles. What she heard was, Principles of Miracles, which began. There is no order of difficulty in miracles. One is not harder or bigger than another. They are all the same. All expressions of love are maximal. Miracles as such do not matter. The only thing that matters is their source, which is far beyond evaluation. Miracles occur naturally as expressions of love. The real miracle is the love that inspired them. In this sense, everything that comes from love is a miracle. All miracles mean life, and God is the giver of life. His voice will direct you very specifically. You will be told all you need to know. Miracles are habits and should be involuntary. They should not be under conscious control. Consciously selected miracles can be misguided. Miracles are natural. When they do not occur, something has gone wrong. The telephone interrupted, and Helen did not hear the voice again until that evening at home, when it continued to dictate the principles of miracles right where it had left off, at number 7. That night Helen finished taking down the 50 principles of miracles that begin the text. Even though she refused to read what she had written, she remained stunned. She did not have any idea of what A Course in Miracles was. It could have been just the 50 principles as far as she was concerned, but she did know that the material was coming from an unusual, authoritative source, one she did not intellectually believe in. Thus began the actual transmission of the material which Helen would take down in more than 100 shorthand notebooks over a period of 7.5 years. The situation proved to be tremendously paradoxical. On the one hand, she resented the voice, objected to taking down the material, was extremely fearful of the content, and had to overcome great personal resistance, especially in the beginning stages, in order to continue. On the other hand, it never seriously occurred to her not to do it, even though she frequently was tremendously resentful of the often infuriating interference. The morning after she took down the 50 principles, she met Bill at the office an hour before the staff usually arrived. Since their offices were away from the main flow of traffic in the building, thanks to Bill's choice 2 years previously, they did not have to be concerned with people coming by and inquiring as to what they were doing. Nevertheless, they locked the door to Bill's office every morning over the next 7.5 years, whenever they met to go over the material she had taken down the previous day. When Bill asked Helen that morning to read aloud what she had written so he could type it up, she could barely get the words out. Before she was halfway through the first sentence, she began a coughing fit that lasted over 5 minutes. Then she had to keep clearing her throat, as it seemed to be continually filling with phlegm. After more than an hour, she had been able to dictate only the first 18 principles, and Bill had to leave to keep an appointment. They decided to try and finish the transcribing after work that day. Bill was finally able to receive the 50 principles from Helen late that afternoon, after much stuttering, stammering, yawning, and coughing on her part. He gave her the original copy he had typed, while he took the carbon home with him. As he carefully read and digested what he had typed, he realized that if it were all true, then absolutely everything he had believed in the past would be false. He was not only startled, but very apprehensive, for he recognized that if he were to take the material seriously, it would involve him in a mind shift of tremendous proportions, one which seemed to be far in excess of what he personally felt he could do. He was also aware that somehow he had asked for a better way, and there was no question in his mind that this was the answer to his request. He had never tried to envision what that answer might be, as he certainly never would have expected that it might come in this form. He felt overwhelmed with doubts. However, he also felt a sense of obligation to at least try to suspend disbelief, for not only had he asked for it, but he recognized almost instantly the truth of many of the 50 principles. He also felt there was a vague familiarity to them, even though they contradicted his conscious belief system and seemingly bore little resemblance to anything he had known in the past. Bill called Helen that evening and asked her what she felt about the 50 principles. She told him she had not reread them and had no interest in doing so. She said she had reluctantly agreed to take down the material, but that didn't mean she had to read it, think about it, discuss it, or believe it. She added that a voice had been dictating that evening, and it looked as though she and Bill had better adjust their schedules so they could meet regularly at his office every morning at 7 o'clock. The following morning was a repetition of the previous one. However, through the coughing, the sighing, and the inability to see my notes, Helen did manage to dictate, and Bill was able to type everything she had taken down the previous day. Bill then told Helen he had to read the material back to her, since they had to be sure he had typed it correctly. And though she protested that she didn't want to hear it, she recognized the importance of what he said, so she agreed to listen. Revelation induces complete but temporary suspension of doubt and fear. It reflects the original form of communication between God and His creations, involving the extremely personal sense of creation sometimes sought in physical relationships. Physical closeness cannot achieve it. Miracles, however, are genuinely interpersonal and result in true closeness to other. Helen interrupted and told Bill he'd better start again. When he asked why, she answered, "I can't seem to hear the words. I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear a word you're saying." Throughout the years, this seemed to be a rather persistent affliction that affected Helen during Bill's readings, although eventually he always managed to get through the material he had typed that day. From the very beginning, both Helen and Bill found the material very fear-promoting as it emerged. Although Bill had to admit, there certainly was nothing about the content that was threatening per se. The threat to his belief system, however, proved a monumental problem for him to reconcile. In addition, the religious terminology and the indicated source of the dictation were not easy for either of them to accept. Helen, a professed atheist, had no doubt the material was being given her by Jesus, for the course was dictated in the first person and at one point states, "The name of Jesus Christ as such is but a symbol, but it stands for love that is not of this world. It is a symbol that is safely used as a replacement for the many names of all the gods to which you pray. This course has come from Him because His words have reached you in a language you can love and understand." By the end of the first 10 days, Bill had typed 14 pages, but when he met Helen the next morning, she had no material to read him. Since neither of them had any idea of what A Course in Miracles was, or how long it might be, Bill wondered if the course was completed. Helen said it wasn't, but she simply wasn't going to take any more down until she knew what it was for. Bill's pragmatic response was that the only way he knew for her to get that answer was to ask the voice. If it doesn't tell you, it obviously doesn't want you to continue. This thought was hopeful enough to Helen so that she agreed to ask that evening. This was the answer she received. "The world situation is worsening to an alarming degree. People all over the world are being called on to help and are making their individual contributions as part of an overall pre-arranged plan. Part of the plan is taking down A Course in Miracles, and I'm fulfilling my part in the agreement as you will fulfill yours. You will be using abilities you developed long ago and which you are not really ready to use again. Because of the acute emergency, however, the usual slow evolutionary process is being bypassed in what might best be described as a celestial speed-up." Helen could sense the urgency that lay behind this explanation, regardless of what she might have thought about its content. She strongly sensed that what was being conveyed to her was that time was running out. In an unusual act for her, she reread the message, and when she finished, she knew on some level that she did not understand she had volunteered to do this job. That seemed so strange and bizarre to her that she was ready to throw her notebook in the trash basket, and yet it triggered something like a long-ago memory in her, in which she said, "Of course I'll go, Father. It's for such a little while." Still, she was obviously not completely satisfied, for she tried one more time to abdicate her position. "Why me?" she asked. "I'm not religious. I don't understand these things. I don't even believe them. I'm about the poorest choice you could make." The answer came back very clearly. "On the contrary, you are an excellent choice. In fact, the best." "But why?" she anguished. And then, without a hint of a doubt, she heard the answer. "Because you'll do it." Helen had no response to that. She knew the voice was right. She knew she would do it. And from that moment on, the future of A Course in Miracles was set. Helen would scribe it to its completion, even though she might raise loud objections all along the way. Although there was a kind of predestination to Helen's taking down the course, she was hardly a completely willing participant. One morning, 2 weeks after the scribing had begun, Bill removed the material he had just typed from his typewriter and read it back to Helen according to the procedure they had previously worked out. When he had completed reading aloud, he asked her what a particular sentence meant to her. She told him she hadn't heard the sentence except as individual words to be checked for accuracy, since she really had no interest in what the material meant. She then told him she thought the best way for them to handle the assignment they seemed to have undertaken together was for Bill to read the material for content, while she would check on the style and make sure the syntax and grammar were correct, since that was all she really cared about. Although Bill knew how threatened Helen felt by all that the material implied, he also thought that Helen's intellectual curiosity would not allow her to remain so isolated from the heart of the material. He assumed that before too much time went by, her intellect would overcome her fears sufficiently so that she would indeed become as engrossed in the content as he was. As the transcribing continued, however, his assumption proved to be only partly correct, for although Helen was perfectly aware of what the material said, she remained extremely uncomfortable discussing it with Bill for nearly a year. During that time, to try and help Helen overcome her apprehensions, Bill suggested that they get in touch with Hugh Lynn Casey of the ARE and show him what Helen had taken down. Helen, of course, resisted the idea immediately, indicating that it would be dangerous for their careers to show the material to anyone. After weeks of reassuring her, however, Bill finally got her to agree that it might indeed be helpful to know what Hugh Lynn thought of the material, since his work had brought him into contact with many similar paranormal experiences. Helen finally agreed to let Bill show him what she had taken down on the condition that their meeting would be completely confidential. In Bill's continuing search for knowledge about the paranormal, he had remained in touch with the ARE, and so it was easy for him to arrange a meeting with Hugh Lynn, with whom he had remained in phone contact since the time he and Helen had visited Virginia Beach. They met in New York during one of Hugh Lynn's visits to the city, and Helen brought along almost everything she had thus far taken down. Since Bill had told him on the phone much of the background behind Helen's writing, very little had to be said about it, and after a few pleasantries, Hugh Lynn asked if he could look through the manuscript while they were together. As he leafed through the pages, Hugh Lynn became more and more engrossed, and his comments indicated he was indeed impressed. After a while, he put the manuscript down and shook his head in amazement. "Remarkable," he said. "It's absolutely inspired." He went on to tell them he felt parts of it were quite similar to the more spiritual portions of his father's trance reading. Since Bill had previously spoken to Hugh Lynn about Helen's discomfort regarding what was happening to her, Hugh Lynn made a special point of telling Helen that he was well aware of what an overwhelming job she was doing, and assuring her that he knew how difficult it must be for her. "However," he said, "you seem to have been chosen to do this because you're obviously a very advanced soul. I only wish you could see yourself as I do." Although the meeting with Hugh Lynn did not relieve Helen of her apprehensions, his support did seem to comfort her somewhat, and she did continue the work, if not with a great deal of ease, at least with somewhat less unease. The voice would dictate to Helen almost daily, and sometimes several times a day. The timing never conflicted with work or social activities, starting at some time when she was reasonably free to write without interference. As a result, she began to carry her shorthand notebook with her almost everywhere she went, just in case. That in itself, of course, was no guarantee that she would do the job without protesting. She could, and very often did, refuse to cooperate, at least initially. But she soon discovered she could have no peace until she relented and joined in once again. Despite being aware of this, she still sometimes refused to write for extended periods. When this occurred, it was usually at Louis' urging that she did return to work, for he knew full well that she could only eliminate her distress by resuming her function as coarse scribe, and he was able to convince her that to continue fighting the inevitable could only have a deleterious effect on their relationship. Evenings turned out to be a favorite time for the voice to dictate. Helen objected bitterly to this, as the writing was in no way automatic and always required her full cooperation, and she resented her evenings being impinged on. Often, in a fit of defiance, she would go to bed without writing anything. When she did this, she couldn't sleep and would eventually get up in disgust and write as directed. Sometimes she was so tired that she went back to bed and fell asleep after taking down only a few paragraphs. However, she would be impelled to continue with this section before breakfast the next morning, perhaps finishing it on her way to work or at odd moments between work pressures during the day. She never knew when she started a sentence how it would end, and the ideas came so quickly that she had trouble keeping up with them, even though she used a combination of shorthand symbols and abbreviations she had developed during years of taking class notes and recording therapy sessions.